Special edition versions of games are a rare treat for hardcore fans, but not every game is granted the red carpet treatment, with big sellers and low sellers both as likely to receive a special edition, major titles being overlooked, and even within franchises there are often big differences in which titles receive special editions and which ones don't. So, what exactly are Nintendo's criteria for releasing these games? And what can we expect from the future in terms of special editions of Nintendo titles? Special thanks to Tumult on Patreon for suggesting this video and helping me to source some examples. Let's start by looking at the kinds of games that have received special editions over the years. For the purposes of this video, I'm not really going to consider the many games which have sales bonuses. Between Luigi's Mansion 3 Polterpup keychains, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity themed notebooks, and Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury steelbooks, there have been all sorts of pack-in paraphernalia that Nintendo has offered to incentivize early purchases, often specific to particular retail outlets. Quite how these are arranged is a little opaque, but it seems likely that Nintendo will generate promotional content in small amounts and use excesses of these as incentives in deals hammered out regionally with major suppliers. Having plenty of small game-related items is probably of benefit to them, as they can experiment with what's popular, try out new merchandise for their stores and theme parks, and make the launches slightly more memorable. However, these special edition or collector's edition games are a little different. At the launch of the Nintendo Switch, Zelda Breath of the Wild actually had two varied versions, and subsequent special editions include Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate with the GameCube controller, Fire Emblem Three Houses, Astral Chain, Zelda Link's Awakening, Pokemon Sword and Shield with the Steelbooks, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, Metroid Dread, Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet Double Pack, Bayonetta 3, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Emio the Smiling Man in Japan, and Nintendo World Championships in the US. This is a rate of about 2 to 3 per year, although even then, there's not an awful lot of consistency as to when and how these turn up. This year, for example, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, a game surely perfect for a special edition, is instead receiving just the purchase bonuses of a holographic sticker set and a desk mat. Why on earth they're calling it a desk mat and not a mouse mat, I'm not entirely sure, although I suspect this is a corporate directive. Perhaps Nintendo wants to ensure that people don't think mouse mode requires a mat. All that said, there are definitely some common themes with releases we have had. Fire Emblem, Xenoblade, and Zelda turn up a lot, although not in all cases. With Zelda, both Wild titles and Link's Awakening receive bespoke special editions. With Echoes of Wisdom, there was a Steelbook version, but of course there was also a celebratory Zelda version of the Switch Lite, and potentially Nintendo might have wanted to direct those people who wanted something commemorative towards the variant system rather than just a special edition of the singular game. They could put out the Steelbook, which may at one point have been intended as part of a special edition version, but ultimately was used as an incentive for sales. Similarly, Zelda Skyward Sword released alongside bespoke Joy-Con, and Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee could be bought with the Pokeball accessory. That's not to say Nintendo are against having two different offers at once, though. Tears of the Kingdom had a bespoke Switch OLED model as well as a special edition of the game, and so did Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. The difference here is that both were positioned less as one-off collector's novelties, but rather as potential routes for people to enter either the Switch ecosystem to start with, or, more likely, to upgrade to the OLED model. Therefore, these potentially had bigger mass market appeal being tied to a major game, and so in this case they could afford to have both a special edition and something major to entice people into the new ecosystem in terms of a revised console. Now, I might have assumed that those decisions were being made by marketing, far removed from the people making the actual games themselves, but Ko Shiota's comments in a March 2024 investor Q&A suggests otherwise. Shiota, the general manager of the Nintendo Technology Department, noted, "The developers are not simply creating a variety of consoles decorated with characters. Our goal is always to develop hardware with specifications that feel like they are of value to people. Special edition hardware is often released around the same time as new software, and in order to incorporate RIP in the designs, the hardware developers work closely with the software teams as an integrated hardware and software development effort. In developing this kind of special edition hardware, we focus on creating a sense of value for customers. This means incorporating not only inventive designs and colors, but also manufacturing techniques that are not used in the regular versions. End quote. Manufacturing techniques that are not used in the regular versions is kind of an interesting comment because, let's be frank, most of these special edition consoles are basically just redecorated versions of the original hardware. But it also makes sense of one obscure reason why Nintendo might choose to do a limited edition console. If they seek to make a change in their manufacturing process at any point, you don't want to experiment with a change while things are ticking along very nicely, thank you. However, a limited run console means chopping and changing in any event, so it would be logical to use an opportunity like this to overhaul processes, or at least to try different processes, and then review before bolstering up to regular production again. Now, my guess is that a new version of a console, even if it's just a redecoration, would need more lead-up time than a special edition. At the very least, it's a more costly endeavour to put out a console and have it on the shelves. If people decide the console dress is ugly and they get left on the shelves for a long time, that's an expensive error, not just in terms of returned inventory, but in the opportunity cost of sales they could have made on people who are interested in a Switch, but not in that specific look, and who might therefore have been put off their purchase. Therefore, my hunch is that Nintendo will probably start identifying which games are going to be used in this way very early on. Here the emphasis will be on gift potential and the capacity to sell systems. Take Animal Crossing. In one sense, it seems like an ideal game to have a special edition of the game itself. It has an older and therefore probably more affluent audience profile, it has extremely hungry fan bases, and there's a proven track record of selling amiibo cards and other items off the back of the game. But Animal Crossing is a system seller, so the focus would go on to how to position the title to best achieve that goal. I think this may indicate why Metroid Prime 4 doesn't seem to be given a special edition version this year. Had I thought to forecast it, I would have naturally assumed that Metroid Prime 4 of all games would receive one. It is, after all, a hugely expensive game with a dedicated fan base. The thing is, though, they are selling things off the back of it, both the Metroid Prime visual retrospective book and 3 different amiibos. So they evidently made a judgment as to the best way to sell content off the back of the game release, and have concluded, perhaps wisely, that they can draw in Metroid fans with a wider range of offers rather than relying on a secondary version of the game which already has 2 different editions on the shelf with the Switch and Switch 2 versions, despite being a fairly low-selling title. It's not that under different circumstances a Metroid Prime 4 special edition wouldn't be a slam dunk, but the timing isn't really optimal for one to launch. That's not to say that smaller games don't receive special editions. Both Emmy of the Smiling Man Famicom Detective Club and Nintendo World Championship NES Edition received region-specific collector sets. In both cases, though, Nintendo didn't necessarily want to broaden out these franchises as IP that could support multiple merchandising strategies. The single purchase of the game was going to be the opportunity to maximize the sale. The Famicom Detective Club game may be a low seller, but there is a niche market for Japanese detective fiction, and I imagine their experiment with selling the physical versions of the original games gave them an idea of the capacity to sell these copies, while Nintendo World Championships had a very clear nostalgic appeal to players of an age profile likely to be willing to indulge in nostalgia. Indeed, one major factor in selecting games to push seems likely to be the age profile and particularly the financial status of the audience it's targeting. With rare exceptions like Kirby's Dream Collection, the younger skewing titles tend not to get a special edition version. Sure, Splatoon may get bespoke Joy-Con colors and a special edition Switch, but that's stuff that many of Splatoon's younger players would have bought for them. A pricey special edition version of a title requiring pre-ordering feels more like the kind of thing dedicated fans would go in for on their own behalf. With franchises like Fire Emblem, Xenoblade, and indeed Metroid, these sales are relatively low by Nintendo standards, and so Nintendo need to find ways to maximize their return on investment. There's also a risk that you can do this kind of thing too often. Even with a big title like Super Mario Odyssey, yes, it's a huge event title, but ultimately, Mario games on the system are very common already. Plus, a special edition really needs to be something that's released on quite a limited basis, whereas those kinds of games are designed to sell indefinitely. Now, there are clearly exceptions. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate had a special edition, but this was largely to sell the GameCube controller, and so this could reasonably be identified as something only for the very hardcore and dedicated fans, to say nothing of the fact that anybody with a nostalgic hankering for the GameCube days were likely also to be older, and therefore, as I've explained before, more likely to be able to afford such a thing. Then there were the Breath of the Wild editions at launch, but I think we shouldn't underestimate how much Nintendo needed to make a return on its investment at this particular point in its life. In 2017, they were struggling to scale up demand for Switch and sinking a lot into manufacture, all the while coming off a very low-selling system. At the same time, the 3DS was in its 7th year on the market, and Breath of the Wild was surely the most expensive title they had ever made by far to date. They needed to recoup costs fast, and so the special editions and pre-selling the DLC must have been part of the strategy to do so quickly. In this case, a special edition made more sense than ancillary materials. Yes, they ultimately did do books and extra amiibo for the champions, but on day one, they focused on the most iconic amiibo. Zelda, Link, the Guardians and Bokoblins, and otherwise just tried to make the game itself go for a higher price point, maximizing the return on their sales. Now, all of this explains Nintendo's actions retrospectively, but what can we learn going forward? I don't think there are any hard and fast rules we can apply, but I think we can probably infer some general principles. First of all, Nintendo appears to have a strategy around game releases for how they can upsell people when they purchase the game. In some cases, this will be having consoles available. In other cases, Amiibo. In fact, the games may themselves be the item being upsold. Consider how Nintendo frequently promotes their breadth of Mario titles to the many people who are broadly interested in Mario-related content, but might not be as committed to any specific franchise. It certainly seems that Donkey Kong Country Returns HD was positioned as effectively an upsell for people who were jazzed by the Donkey Kong Bonanza reveal, but weren't yet ready to go all in on an expensive new system, while the Luigi's Mansion trilogy now being available in one form or another on Switch 2 seems to be a way to tap into excitement around the Mario anniversary, the forthcoming film, and of course the Halloween event in many Western territories. This might explain the release of Luigi's Mansion on 3DS only a few months before Luigi's Mansion 3 was announced. They get the moment to put the game out, but then the real reason for it is as an upsell a few months down the line. Any game which would benefit from a large amount of ancillary merchandise and that could stand alone probably doesn't naturally lend itself to having a special edition. Even then, there are oddities. Xenoblade games have always received special editions, but 2025's Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition went without. My guess is that this was a casualty of its release slot. It will be difficult to get even the most avid of Xenoblade Chronicles X fans to shell out extra for a special edition before Nintendo are asking people to pre-order a pricey new system in the coming days. It's a bit of a pity, as if it had launched at another time, it seems like it would have been an ideal time for a special edition, and I'm not entirely sure why they didn't reschedule it, except I suppose that it was really the only significant Switch game they had for the first 8 months of 2025. Under normal circumstances, I would expect Fire Emblem, most Zeldas, Xenoblade, and Platinum titles to continue to receive special editions, as there's a proven audience for these. Also likely to get the nod is content which is niche and where they need to find ways to sell at a higher margin. This also includes Fire Emblem and Xenoblade, but more perfectly describes Famicom Detective Club, the Platinum games, and Nintendo World Championships. There's a narrow window of time where hype is maximal for releases like this, and so putting a Nintendo World Championship or Astral Chain Special Edition out is a way to make those opening sales go that much further. Finally, there are those times when there is a specific reason. The Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet double packs, where the Steelbook is an added incentive, or Metroid Dread, which didn't have any ancillary behind the scenes merchandise, which was being released in proximity to the OLED, but was hardly a pack-in or specific OLED tie-in, and so was the sort of title that could use one to ensure that it received the maximum bang for Nintendo's buck. Looking ahead then, what fate special editions and collector's sets? Well, firstly, I wouldn't get too caught up on special editions specifically as an end in themselves, since it seems to me that this is just one tool in Nintendo's broader upselling strategy. Logic dictates that where special editions have been successful before, we will continue to get more of them. Take Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. It's a Switch 2 exclusive game, so there's no issues with competing versions. It's a series which has usually benefited from special editions before. It also has a fairly short hype window. This is the first console Fire Emblem title in 3.5 years, and so if they want to maximize purchases while the spotlight is on Fire Emblem, it would make sense to do one. On the other hand, it's completely plausible that they think Fire Emblem has jumped up a rung in terms of scope and audience attention, and that, especially if the game turns out to be more closely connected to Three Houses than even the cameo of Sothis indicated, that they may want to be more ambitious. A suite of amiibo including Sothis and a Fortune's Weave art book may be considered a better utilization of the spotlight than just a special edition game. If they want to put Fire Emblem more squarely into the bracket of franchises that they just push continuously, having ancillary content that can remain on the shelves instead of just milking audiences on day one may be beneficial. There's also an outside chance that Fortune's Weave is connected to new hardware. Fire Emblem has also for a long time been tied to the handheld consoles after all, and will be a good vanguard for a Switch 2 Lite. That said, Three Houses was scheduled for 2018, even if it did ultimately release just ahead of the Lite, and so it probably seems unlikely, and that Fire Emblem will be a year or so before any new hardware comes into play. To end this video then, let's put this into some forecasts. I'm using percentages to quantify my expectations of how likely something is, not because I've got some secret statistical inside track into Nintendo's workings, but simply as a tool to sharpen my judgment and nose for Nintendo through experience. 50% calls theoretically being right 50% of the time, and so on. Therefore, I'd like to make the following forecasts with regard to special editions or collector's editions. I think it's 70% likely that we will see a special edition for Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. For the reasons I've outlined above, I think there are reasons to question whether this strategy is still the best fit for Fire Emblem as a franchise, but on balance, I still think continuity of strategy is slightly more likely. However, I would say it seems 90% likely to me that we will see a special or collector's edition by the end of 2027. This may seem rather cautious given that we've seen them regularly until now, but given that Platinum seems to be in a slightly disrupted state, Monolith Soft have just released a game that just leaves Fire Emblem and the next Pokemon double pack, and even then, they may decide this time to skip the Steelbooks if the game is priced at $80 to start with, as seems likely. As for special editions of games, I'm not sure any of the games currently on the slate fit the bill. Tomodachi Life might be an odd shout for one. It's a one-off game, and given that it's been 11 years since the last title, its most loyal audience are likely to be older, but they're also more likely to be casual. That said, I don't really see it. As for Rhythm Heaven, it's not clear that it will even garner a physical release, although if it does garner a limited edition release, it's possible they could do one. I put a special edition for either of these titles at just 10%. Splatoon Raiders is an interesting one though. Historically, Splatoon hasn't had special editions, but it has shifted consoles through specially designed console dresses. However, the audience is growing older, and while Raiders will certainly complement the lineup of Splatoon merch, it also feels like Nintendo may want to try and milk it that bit more. The big problem is that I rather doubt that most of the dedicated players of Raiders would want a physical version anyway, and while in theory they could still do a special edition with a code in a box, it doesn't feel all that special necessarily. All told, I think Splatoon Raiders is just a 10% shout at having a special edition. But am I missing something? Let me know in the comments, do check out Patreon for more, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.